We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Emma Waddington.
And I'm Chris McCurry. And today we are very pleased to have Jonathan Caspi return. Dr. Caspi is a full-time professor at Montclair State University. He received his MSW in 1992 from Hunter College in New York City and his PhD in 1997 from the State University of New York at Albany. Dr. Caspi is an internationally recognized sibling expert, author, speaker, and family therapist. He maintains a small private practice with offices in Montclair and Hazlet, New Jersey. He has a book coming out in December titled Raising Loving Siblings, published by Guilford Press. And we will have a link to this book and John's other books, as well as his websites in today's show notes. So welcome, Jonathan Caspi.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I really enjoyed our conversation last time, so I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
We did as well. And just to recap, for those listeners who have not listened to your previous episode, which we would encourage them to do, we were talking about sibling conflict and even how some of the terminology can be a little, if not confusing, misleading. So the difference between conflict and rivalry and such things that are bandied about in popular speech and press and what have you. So we're going to follow up on that today and talk about raising loving siblings. So I'm wondering, where is the jumping off point between conflict and loving? How do we get there?
That's a great question. What's interesting in research actually is that siblings who are highly conflictual are also the closest ones. That is, that closeness and conflicts are linked. And it makes perfect sense, right? Because if you're close, then you spend more time with each other. And then there's more things to sort of bump into along the way, like, everything from, who's going to get the last slice of pizza to, who's better at shooting a basketball, right? And so you have this joint time, which builds closeness, but it also lends itself to conflict. Whereas siblings who are kind of distant from each other, they don't really get into that many fights. They tend to avoid each other, and parents can be helpful in that by saying, each of you stay away from each other. And when they do that, of course, there's less conflict, but there's also a lot less closeness. And as we talked about last time, closeness is hugely important because it has all these amazing lifelong benefits and developmental benefits. People who are closer to siblings have better friends. They report greater happiness in adulthood. They report better health. It's linked to better financial success. Happy people tend to get promoted more and get jobs, hired more frequently. And so, all of these benefits related to close siblings often aren't considered, but that should be the ultimate goal. Plus, parents want their kids to be friends and to be close. And so, unfortunately, it's tough to have one without the other. And so sometimes you're going to have conflict. All relationships do. It's just expected. It's important to be able to, one, help kids learn how to manage conflict in productive ways and then get out of their way. And two, to keep them safe in case the conflict starts to get out of hand. And so it kind of leaves parents in this difficult territory of knowing when to intervene.
That's really reassuring, actually. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and when not to intervene.
And what, yeah.
I was just thinking, as a parent of 3 children, and I desperately want them to have a great relationship, especially after our previous conversation talking about all these wonderful benefits. It's a relief to hear that inevitably building closeness will lead to conflict. Like you can't have one without the other. It's impossible to have one without the other, potentially. That's what I'm hearing, which is quite validating of my personal experience, to be honest.
It's true. I mean, you don't want the conflict to happen a lot. I mean, it's just like, marriages and other relationships. You're going to have conflicts. You're going to bump into things, but you want it to generally be a fairly peaceful, supportive, loving relationship. And that can happen with siblings too, where the conflict can be greatly lessened. It doesn't have to be, this, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a chaotic environment where you're like, oh, is it going to be close and happy today? Or is something going to set the two of them off?
I would imagine that learning to deal with conflict, it would be such an important life skill. And it would be predictive of success in the future because of all the other conflicted relationships or, the conflicts that we're going to encounter in our relationships, future relationships. And it makes me think about the marshmallow study, and which has been criticized, I know, recently, but still the idea of self-control as being such an important skill to take into life with you, to delay gratification and all that. And when you have siblings, you have to learn a lot of self-control because you just can't get whatever you want all the time.
100%. Emotional regulation is so key to being successful in life. Although there is a confounding piece of information, and I don't want to send this conversation in a different direction, but who does the best on pretty much all measures in this regard is only children. So, and they don't, they actually do very well academically and socially and income and everything else. And yet they don't have to typically deal with sibling conflict. However, there's a really important, piece to that, which is that's only true if they grow up in a happy, low conflict household. If they grow up in a high stress, high conflict household, then they do worse than everybody because they don't have the benefit of sibling support. They're alone.
You mentioned that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry.
Time. No, but I think that is an important thing to point out because it seems like there's always but there's this element to all of these things. But it is important to note that there are children out there, such as my own, who did not grow up with siblings, and yet he had to deal with conflict between himself and his parents.
That's what happens. So a three-legged stool is always interesting to sit on. But that said, your point earlier, Chris, was super important, which is that the siblings do provide an important training ground for life. And one of them is, you can't just do whatever you want to other people. You have to take them into consideration and engage in perspective taking and emotionally regulate yourself and learn how to, compliment and provide support and, express anger and frustration in productive ways. And so it's a great place for siblings to learn, for children to learn is in the sibling context.
It's gladiator school.
Yes, that's true.
I was reading an article about siblings, and it was saying how, there really is no other relationship like our sibling relationship. In as much as, siblings are there for, unless something horrible happens, for all of our lives, whilst, our partner comes in later in life and our parents perhaps die early in life, our siblings are there the whole time. And they get to sort of experiment with us. They get to learn about the world with us. And it is such a long relationship that I can see that why it can be so beneficial to our well-being, because they are there all the time and they have our back in conflicts. They are our training ground, to learn about conflicts. They can get us out of trouble, with our parents. They really can be our companion in so much of our lives. So it does, thinking of it like that, I can see how special it really is. There's no other relationship like it.
And all those things you said are true. Plus, there are eyewitnesses to life, right? They're there in our greatest moments and in our worst moments. And, they know us in ways that most people will never. And they have memories of early childhood that you won't be able to share with anybody else. And in fact, when you talk to older people who have lost a sibling, they'll frequently say that was the hardest loss, that it was terrible losing their parents, and, even losing a spouse, as painful as it is, there's something about that lifelong witness that it's, when your sibling goes, so does your history, your shared history. Mm-hmm. And that's very reassuring to have, especially as we age, to have people who, and we get increasingly isolated, unfortunately, that we have people that we feel like there's a common language in history.
And yet I've noticed amongst my siblings that our histories tend to be a little different. I mean, we'll be having these conversations and they'll say, oh, remember when this happened? And it's like, I don't think it happened that way, but that's their memory of, X, Y, or Z situation. It's really interesting that, we all have these different angles on the same event, sometimes radically different.
Oh, but even in that disagreement, there's a connection, right? Because you're still talking about a shared event with your different perspectives. But part of the reason you have different perspectives is that, you're not just different people, but you grew up in different families. Like you're in the same family, but your experience of your parents is different. It's different being a second born than a fourth born. My memory is that you had, was there 6 of you?
Yes.
Yeah. And so you all kind of carry your own special set of glasses through your whole life where, you have the shared experience, but such a different experience at the same time.
Oh yeah. Our parents were very different parents for my eldest sister versus my youngest sister.
Yeah. And in many ways, right? I mean, one, they were much more relaxed. Your younger sister was able to get away with a lot more.
Oh, yeah.
But also probably other things too. You may, there may be financial differences. Families tend to get more stable as they get older, and then of course your younger sister had the benefit of being parented by your oldest sister.
Right.
And I don't know your family.
It's very accurate and very accurate.
Out of curiosity, is there a difference in terms of the quality of the sibling relationship if the different genders? Like, do boys get on better with boys and girls get on better with girls? As in, is the power of the relationship better if you're the same gender? Or does it not matter? Does gender not play a part?
Having a sister makes everything better.
As in...
My sisters would agree with that.
Oh, wow. So versus brothers, 2 boys or 3 boys. Oh, interesting.
Yep. No.
Fascinating.
Sister relationships are fairly unique that way. They tend to be closer, and having a sister tends to make relationships with brothers closer too. Part of that is just the way we're socialized. Women generally towards relationships and men towards independence. And so, and also about which, how we communicate and other kinds of things. So when you look at research on closeness, for example, it goes, sisters bring everything up.
Wow. That's really interesting. Because I've always wondered about the gender piece. Because you see brothers sort of, they do have a different relationship. I'm one of 3 sisters. My husband's one of 3 brothers. And I see it very different. I mean, it's very different. How often we speak versus how often they speak, what we speak about. Fascinating. So
what you speak about that's a big one, right? Like,
it's big.
I'll talk to my brother for an hour on the phone and my wife will say, what did you talk about? And I'll say, I don't know. We talked about soccer, this and that. And she's like, well, did you find out about, his girlfriend or whatever? I'm like, no. Why would I ask that?
My wife always says men never ask the right questions.
Exactly.
I'm with her. I'll do the same. My husband will come off the phone. I'll be like, so what about this? No idea. I'm like, what? How's that possible? How could you not ask about this?
It's funny how this sibling conversation became about how men don't know how to ask questions.
Yeah.
It's never far from the surface. But so I know Emma is eager to hear your wisdom around how to raise a loving sibling. So, well, first of all, how did you get into deciding to write about that particular topic?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we talked about in the prior podcast, my interest really in siblings came in a very academic way, where I was in the PhD program and I came across this research study, which said, two research studies actually, that said two different things. One said that the most common form of child maltreatment and violence in families is sibling violence. And, at that point, I'd already been a practitioner, gone to grad school, and I was like, how could that be? And I never heard of it. And in fact, the numbers are so crazy because it's more prevalent than parent abuse of children, peer bullying, and domestic violence or partner violence combined.
Wow.
And yet,
That's
right?
crazy.
And I'm like, how do I not know this? And, I've done many workshops over the years where I've talked to, therapists from a variety of backgrounds. And I'll start by saying, how many of you have heard the term sibling abuse? And when I started doing this in the 1990s, out of a room of 100 people, you might get two hands up. Now people are more familiar with the term, but the prevalence is probably not, still catches people by surprise. So that was the first one. And I said, I have to learn more about that. And then the second piece was, and we may have talked about this in the prior podcast too, which is that a study came out. It was called "Why Are Siblings So Different?" Written mostly from a genetic, perspective, which is, if we share the same genes, we should really be alike. But and we also grow up in the same house, eat the same food, go to the same playgrounds, everything is the same, right? And so, but that when you look at personality tests and psychological adjustment tests, we're as different as random pairs of strangers on the street. And so if you take just two people randomly and you give them a depression inventory, an anxiety inventory, a personality test, the way they score is similar to the way siblings would score. So how could siblings be so different when they're same, right? Same genetics, typically, not always, but, and then, same households. And the answer is, in large part, so at the end of the study, it said, maybe somebody who's not a geneticist, they didn't write it this way, but that's basically what they were saying, can explain how this happens. And I thought, well, I'd like to try to explain how that happens. I want to give that a shot. So, I started kind of delving into siblings, and that really was the motivation for getting into the field. And then, you start to discover other things along the way, like how incredibly powerful sibling relationships are in terms of their protective effects. I mentioned this last time too, that when, you look at siblings of divorce, like children of divorce, they often fall temporarily, but fall behind academically, and they have behavior issues and things like that. Not if they have a good sibling relationship, though, that it can buffer the effects of very difficult life events. And there's a number of examples of where siblings can buffer those harsh events. And so I thought, well, it's really important that we help siblings become close. And there really aren't books that target that direction. There's a lot of, self-help books that are about stopping sibling fighting, but not about building closeness. And so, both things need to happen simultaneously.
That's one of the things that struck me from our previous conversation, as well as the sort of sibling abuse. It's absolutely floored me. And that, like we discussed, there's a certain acceptance that somehow that will just be the case. But the other piece is how important siblings are and how little we think about that. Like, even from a clinical perspective, when, young people are going through a divorce, as clinicians, we don't think about working on the sibling relationship, but it sounds like that should be exactly what we're focusing on and targeting. And even when we're doing parenting work, thinking about the siblings, it just doesn't seem to be something that people, refer to or reflect on as much as we really should. And even the study that you talked about, the Harvard study, and how sibling relationship was so predictive of well-being and happiness. Again, that's not something I've heard, and having, watched lots of TED Talks about the study, I don't remember that being such a big piece of it. And yet, wow, how important. So I love that we're having this conversation, because it seems like one of the key pieces for parents to have in mind is how to nurture these really important relationship, the most important they'll ever have. And as a parent of 3, I'm particularly interested to hear about it, because I feel outnumbered fairly regularly. And I think it's quite complicated because of all those tensions that we talked about last time, that, sibling conflict, the inevitable comparison will make that relationship at times quite difficult. So
it's true. I mean, being a parent it's kind of a lose proposition with siblings, and we can get into that in a second. And we can sort of set up, like, how do we make relationships better relationships? But what you were just saying about, once you put on the sibling glasses, it's 2 things happen. One is it's everywhere, right? You just see it everywhere. You see it show up in the dynamic of their growing up with siblings, show up in their marital relationships. You see it in playground. You see it everywhere, right? And then the other piece of it is that it as a researcher or as a clinician, it makes you think about how you approach things very differently, right? Like, you're spot on. What you said is exactly what I said to my classes. And maybe this was covered in the last podcast too. I don't remember. But, clinicians typically, when kids are going through divorce, often talk about, the emotional pain of it, and the transitions, and, the divided loyalty feelings and all those kind of things, where building positive sibling relationships may be the best move. Not to talk about those other things, but it provides a direction that's a positive direction in treatment. So it's not just focused on, like, how do you manage this adversity? It's, how can you do this with the benefit of becoming closer to a sibling?
And I think, like, as you're sharing about it, I'm thinking at every stage of life, like when you're recovering from, like you mentioned, older adults, or, if you're going through a divorce, if you're going through a health issue, any stage of life, if we can help, or if we can even reflect on, how's my sibling relationship going, and should I nurture that? Because we often think about turning to friends, and as clinicians, I often think about that. And I must admit that it's a blind spot. It's been a blind spot for me to think about siblings.
Oh, I write about this and think about it all the time, and it's still a blind spot sometimes. Just so you know, sometimes I'll be sitting at the dinner table and my kids are fighting with each other, and I'll say, I have to interrupt you because I just want you to know that I'm one of the foremost people in dealing with sibling conflict. I just make them aware. Please continue.
Do they roll their eyes?
They just chuckle at me. Yeah. They roll their eyes at everything I say, Chris. So, but so to kind of get to this piece that I think you're talking about here, Emma, a little bit, is that, part of the reason why it's tough raising siblings is because, one, they're with each other a lot. And anytime people are in the same room with somebody for a long period of time, they're going to bump into conflicts and disagreements, and people are going to have their bad days and be grumpy and come home from school, irritated about something that happened there and take it out on a sibling. And so, it's just, a lot of this is just this living together, business. Plus, again, who gets to eat the last piece of pizza, or, who gets to choose what show you're going to watch or what video game you're going to play. And so there's a lot of that needs to be sorted out in the life of siblings. And then you add on top of it that children pay very close attention to how their parents treat them and then their siblings. And then they're making lots of comparisons around parenting. And, am I a favorite? Am I not a favorite? Am I comparing well? Am I not? Why do you yell at them, but you don't, why do you yell at me, but not at my brother or sister? And so, it's not just living together like when two adults cohabitate. It's living together with, these supervisors who may treat people unequally and even if they try to treat them equally, that's an impossibility. And there's also an audience, right? If you're getting disciplined by your parent, your sibling is watching it. So you have all these kind of things that contribute to fostering competition and comparison, and then perceptions of favoritism. And it's the living together, the combination of one, living together, and two, perceptions of favoritism are kind of the biggies. There's lots of other reasons why siblings get into, fighting with each other. And that also can sometimes get in the way of them being close, right? Because, the conflict, close relationships tend to have more conflict. Those two things are linked because when you're close with somebody and you spend a lot of time with them, you're more likely to get into fights with people than those people that you don't communicate with very often or don't hang with very often, that are more distant in your relationships. So what do you do about all this? Well, one is you have to kind of come up with a plan for daily life, right? Living together. And then you have to address the perceptions of favoritism. And I keep saying perceptions of favoritism rather than favoritism because it has more to do with the way the kids see things than it does the way the parents see things, ultimately, in terms of the nature of the sibling relationship. So, so what do you do? Well, first is, when we were kind of chatting pre-recording, we were talking about, not knowing what the rules in families are, right? Just that parents have to wing it a lot. And that this sort of trying to did I say the right thing? Did I do the right thing? And the more we wing it, the more likely we are to, mess things up. And we can, even inadvertently create more conflict between our kids by the way that we try to intervene, which I'll come back to that later. But, the first thing is to actually try to have, rules of engagement for sibling relationships. So, identify those kind of areas where siblings sort of bump into each other and get into fights, and then come up with rules for what happens.
Preempt it. I think we touched on that briefly last time. So, that instead of being reactive, which inevitably we end up being, it's actually preempting, starting to see the pattern. And like Chris refers to the dance, there is something quite predictable about conflict, isn't there? We know that especially in this household, it's often around bedtime. Everybody's a bit irritable and overtired, especially me. That's when things start to get out of hand, I find. So sort of having quite clear expectations and almost, I think, expectations for me too. What am I going to do? Give myself an expectation. What am I going to do if conflict arises? What am I going to do if I feel like, shouting and getting really frustrated? I think those rules of engagement are really important for everybody, but especially I get very triggered by conflict between my children and not physical. They don't hurt each other. Now and again, they play fight to a degree that I don't like, but, they'll have arguments and I find myself getting quite upset, and that's a big trigger for me. And so having something in my mind about what do I do when that happens is really helpful.
I mean, one of the authors that I like is a gentleman, Gene Dumas, who came out of University of Tennessee, Knoxville, worked with Robert Waller a lot. And he talks about MAPs, motivated action plans. And these are little scripts that the parent, sometimes in collaboration with, consultation with the therapist, will come up with. And when this happens, I'm going to do these, 3 steps to try to steer this in a better direction. And I think even just being able to step back and go, oh yeah, bedtime, and label it and see it as a thing, stepping back from that a little bit, as opposed to, being in the middle of the chaos, to go, oh yeah, bedtime, oh yeah, is a shift from just feeling like you're, completely out of control, but oh yeah, one of these. And that can be enough of a shift to allow the parent to, I remember one time I was in yoga and I was doing some yoga pose and I was the only guy in the room as usual. And I looked around and I'm like about to fall over, and I'm just one of the warrior poses. And I'm like, about to fall over, and all the women around me are serenely doing this pose. And the yoga instructor said to no one in particular, settle into your wobbliness. And I thought, what the heck does that mean? But I said, okay, and I kind of settled into my wobbliness, and it shifted things. And I was still wobbly, but not quite so much. But it made all the difference in the world. And in the kind of therapy that Em and I do, acceptance and commitment therapy, that's part of the acceptance piece of like, oh yeah, this is just the way things are right now. And then you stop fighting it so much and you start looking for some possible, solutions, and you can be creative in those situations sometimes if you're not fighting it.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. You deal with the reality of your situation rather than the fantasy of what it should be. Yeah. That's the acceptance, right? So that's I love the yoga metaphor. That's a really good one. Yeah, but to come back to your point about bedtime too, is that, and Emma, you kind of said it, you can't come up with the rules and the expectations in the moment because you're already frazzled and heated, and it's a terror. So these kind of preemptive discussions first have to happen with a spouse or whoever a co-caregiver is, if there is one, so that you're a team and you're not undermining each other. And so it requires a whole conversation of how are we going to approach this? And then to have a family meeting of sorts, doesn't have to be labeled that, but a sit down when things are sort of calm and nice. And maybe when you're sitting around dinner, say, hey, by the way, let's talk about bedtime. And then you come up with sometimes with your kids, depending on how old they are, you come up with the rules for what bedtime is going to look like. And these are the behaviors we expect you to see. Like, you're going to get in your bed and you're going to stay in your bed, or you're going to read a book for 15 minutes, or whatever your nighttime routine is. And then you can lay out at the time both rewards and consequences. And so, if the child then gets out of the bed, and we're not talking about siblings, this is just, rules in general. But if the child gets out of the bed, then you say, hey, remember what we talked about earlier, and you can do it in a calm way. And you could say, the rule is that once you're in bed, you stay in bed and you read your book. And, if you do that, you get X reward, whatever it is, 10 more minutes on your iPad or whatever. And if you don't, then you will, lose 10 minutes off of your iPad. It doesn't always have to have the negative in there, but, the rewards are usually powerful enough. But, it usually, what it does is it puts the decision-making back on the child and says, here's the rule, you can follow it and things will go really nicely for you. You'll get a reward. And if you don't, then things won't go so nicely. Now it's on you. But parents have to stick to it, and they have to stick to it consistently. But it gives them a very clear, step by step, like, here's the rule. And then you have a chance to have them try it again, so you don't get mad and the kid doesn't get frustrated. It's like, okay, you got out of bed. We talked about how that wasn't something that you're supposed to do. Let's try it again. And you still have an opportunity to get that reward. And then that applies for sibling fighting too. Like, I have to take an important phone call for work. The two of you are going to be in a room together, right? What are the rules for shared time? And if they're little, you decide what the rules are for them, and you can rehearse it and practice it with them. And then if they're bigger, you can have them sort of come up with what they think the rules should be. And that can be a mutual shared discussion. And then once you have them, you can even formalize them. You can write them down. You can put them on the refrigerator. You can do whatever, but they become, those are the rules for living together. And the parents follow the same set of rules. Now, they're not completely rigid. You can, modify them as you need to, but you don't modify them on the fly. You have to have another family meeting first with your partner and then with the children to kind of come up with this action plan, to use the kind of words that Chris was using. And this way you can remain calm. I remember when my son was very little, like he was like 4, he would come into the kitchen and he would go, get me water, something like that. And, in my head, I was like, who do you think you are commanding me? I'm way bigger than you. And so instead of, I would take a deep breath, bite my tongue, and I would say, just go out, come back in and try that again. Because you know how you're supposed to ask for water, right? We've been over this. And then he would come in and he would say, can I please have some water? And I was like, yes. And I make a big deal of it and high five and all that kind of stuff, right? But that's the idea, is you give yourself and you give the child an opportunity to learn the right behavior rather than just expect it. So you have to teach it and then you have to reinforce it. But it's a lot of work up front sometimes, but it makes life so much easier on the back end.
It reminds me of a conversation we had on the podcast with Emily Edlin on autonomy supported parenting, and exactly the same, right? We have to sometimes teach these skills and expectations up front, but then it does make life easier in the long run. But there is a quite a bit of intentionality and self-regulation that is involved, and the planning with your co-parent, like making sure that you're both aligned. Because one of the things that I find really useful about having a co-parent is being able to do tag team. Like if at some point something's, going off with the kids, I can go, you know what? I'm checking out. You take over. And knowing that, taking over doesn't mean a complete new set of rules and, we're off to ice cream. It's actually, you're going to take over from whatever it is that we were meant to be doing together. So yeah, co-parenting does require an ally.
Yeah. And having this, not just an ally, but which is, a shared plan. Because if one parent is like, you have to be in bed at like 8:00 every night, right? That's the rule. And the other parent's like, what's the big deal? Why can't they be up to 8:30? Like, we're so comfortable on the couch and we're watching a show. Why do you have to be so rigid? And just kind of let them sit. Now what has happened is that the child learns that they can pretty much do whatever they want, right? Because the parents are undermining each other. And so those rules, like if it's 8:00, it's 8:00 for both parents, regardless of what's going on, right? Even if you're enjoying a show together, if that's, and so, it does bring a little bit more rigidity to families, but it also brings more predictability. Because, the big problem is that most of parenting in general, at least in my observation, and particularly around siblings, is that we tend to only parent the bad. So, if 2 siblings are in a room playing with each other very nicely for a half an hour, that's like the expectation. And then if they all of a sudden start fighting, that's when the parents get involved. And they're like, you two cut it out and stop yelling. And meanwhile, there was a half hour where they were sharing and complimenting and playing and doing things nicely. And that's the part that really should receive the attention and be parented, because the negative moments, they attract the kind of attention that reinforces that. And then, of course, the way the parents come in makes a big difference, because if the parent says something like, you're older, you should let your younger sibling play with the blocks, they've just taken sides. And now you have perceptions of favoritism, like, you always do that. You always, let them play with the blocks and I never get to. And so, this only parenting in the moment and in the bad stuff almost always makes it worse. So you want to set things up when things are not in the moment, and then to recognize the good things as they happen and parent those. So every time siblings compliment each other in my house, if somebody says something nice to each other, I make a big deal out of it, right? Or if one says to the other, hey, do you want to go outside and kick a ball? I'm like, oh my God, you two are going to play together? That's so awesome. right? Because, that stuff rarely gets attention by parents.
True. It's so true. And I mean, I already feel the guilt because I'm often feeling quite busy. And obviously, what draws my attention is when there is conflict. And that's when I'll come sort of crashing into the room and go, what is going on? Can't leave you 1 minute, blah, blah, blah. Right? I put my hand up, guilty. I find that very stressful. Like, I don't want them to be fighting. I want them to be the best of friends. But of course, I'm busy doing something else. When they're quiet, I'm thinking, great, I have a minute to do X, Y, Z. And the reality is that if that has been happening and there may be more conflict as a result, I need to invest some time in addressing that balance, and that it will take time, and I have to be compassionate and forgiving that, I'm doing the best I can. And as we sort of talked about in the previous, podcast, and you mentioned it's a lose, it's really, it's tough sometimes, and just do the work. Make sure I am attending to when they are connecting and they're being really lovely to each other, and have those plans in place when conflict happens so that it's not, reactive to the situation, and that I don't sort of make matters worse by over intervening. I'm guilty of that. Yeah.
Well, I've attained my objective in the podcast, which is to create guilt. All the listeners, we all do that. We all do that. We all do the stuff you're talking about, which is, you asked me why did I want to write a book on this? And that's precisely the reason, because this kind of winging it approach is really tough. And then it makes us feel like we're failing in places when we're not.
Yeah.
We talked in a recent podcast about parental guilt and how, when you leave the hospital, you have to have a car seat for your child. And it's, here's your car seat. Here's your guilt. Enjoy this for the next, for the rest of your life.
But because this is a sibling podcast, it's worse for the firstborns than it is for the laterborns.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely, because you make all the mistakes.
Well, you actually care about what the car seat is. By the time you get to number 6, you're like, it's kind of buckled in, close enough. Let's go.
Yeah. There's always the roof rim. But it is time for me to say, in the interest of time, how should we leave our listeners?
So what I would love, so here's purely selfishly to prove my own parenting of siblings. I've been thinking about this a lot in preparation for the podcast. And one of the very selfish reasons why I wanted you back is because I wanted to make sure that I had some tips. Realize that.
And you can bill her for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm delighted. I noticed that sort of conflict is very triggering for me, as it is for many parents. And that what I used to do with the boys, so when I had 2 boys and then my daughter's a bit younger, I used to say to them, if there was conflict, I'd often say to them, I trust that you can figure this out. I trust that you've got this. And I'd leave the room. And I remember my eldest, I asked him the other day, do you remember that? And he'd come back and go, you always say that, but we don't. But then they'd figure something out and off they would go. And I noticed that I've stopped doing that as much since my daughter came. And there was something about when she came that I don't use those words as much anymore. I've been intervening more. And it got me thinking, I wonder why I've now started to intervene more. And I think it's because her being the youngest, I worry about them hurting her in some way, even though I haven't got necessarily, thankfully, much evidence of that. That's when a conflict happens. I think, oh no, they're bigger. Something might go wrong. And so then I get much more involved. But as a result, we've had many a conversation about favoritism, about them feeling. And I was thinking, why is this happening? We had that conversation with Katie Palmer. And why are they doing that? And I think it's because I've stopped using the phrase of, I trust you guys can sort this out. And I've been more involved. I've been intervening more. And so I know how hard it is not to intervene, basically. I know how difficult it is not to feel like I've got to try and fix it. So maybe finally just thinking about what are some of those preemptive things that we can do as parents when it comes to conflict, and what do we do when conflict actually happens? How little do we intervene and when to intervene? Because that seems quite...
I
may
thought
not
you
be
said this was in the interest of time.
I know.
I was just going to say...
Oh, that might be too big.
that's a pretty big topic, but I'll give you this. First of all, just this, when people use the word trigger, I teach a class on anxiety now because it's so widespread, especially with the college age population. But when people use the word trigger, what they're really saying is that it's a word that it makes me very anxious. And why do people get anxious? Because they don't feel like they have the tools or the confidence to handle the situation. So when it comes, because something dangerous is about to happen, and I don't know if I have it, right? So if you have a plan, then you'll feel more confident because you feel like you have the tools, and it won't be as triggering anymore. So you can, if you do this kind of preemptive work and then siblings fight, it's just, this is a situation that, to use your language, I have to accept and just kind of manage and not have a fantasy that it's going to go in a different way, or why do I have to do this? I shouldn't have to, you guys fight with each other and now I have to be responsible for something. And so, what you can, the rules of engagement, just like we talked about for bedtime, are the same for sibling fighting. If you two disagree, how are you supposed to manage that? Like, what do you do? And, you can, teach if you have to, you walk away and come back to it, right? You can teach if they're little that they might need to call a parent to help them. You can teach, self-regulation kind of behaviors. Like, you don't yell and you don't punch, and those become, but you have to give the substitute behavior instead. Like, what do you do instead of you make a request using the word please? You kind of give the rules for how you want them to manage when conflict arrives. And then if they follow it, then you can, again, reward it and call attention to it and high five and praise it. And if they don't, you can give them another shot and say, remember what we talked about. Here's what you're supposed to do in that moment. And then, and say, try it again. And then you can step out, because when you intervene, there's always going to be perceptions of favoritism. I mean, it's the classic example of cutting the birthday cake. You can cut it exactly the same, but still one person thinks the other one got more. And it's the same thing with when you apply discipline. You can do it exactly the same, but it may not be perceived the same. And then the other thing that I would suggest is that the favoritism is really corrosive to relationships. To sibling relationships. It makes them fight more. It makes them not like each other. It gets in the way of closeness. It's layered with things. Most parents don't believe that they are engaging in favoritism, right? But it doesn't really matter so much as what the parent believes is what the kids believe. And so often what happens is the kid will say, you're playing favorites, or, it's unfair. And the parent goes, no, I treat all of you the same. I love you the same. And, it's all and they dismiss it, which only then confirms in the mind of the child that they really are disfavored, because here they are saying, hey, mom or dad, take this seriously. And you're like, I'm not. And so if you're not, that means that they're being disregarded. And so it just reinforces that whole thing. And it's a very tricky kind of thing, because parents may actually be playing favorites without knowing it. For example, protecting, your daughter because she's smaller, and it seems so legitimate, but at the same time, it does put her in a position of privilege. The other thing is that, favoritism is a very fuzzy concept, because one, most kids, you probably are familiar with this research, but parents, when they're asked about favoritism, and they don't use the word favoritism. They use words like, do you spend more time with one than the other? Do you feel closer? Do you have more conflict? Do you have more disappointment with one? Or is there one that you feel more proud of? They ask those kind of questions, and they kind of, there is some favoritism research, but most of it asks these sort of around, side questions, because asking favoritism is too taboo. And most parents say, yes, there is a child that, I feel more I express more pride about, there is a child that I feel more connected to, or, that we just kind of click or we get along and those kinds of things. And, that's just natural. That's just what's going to happen in relationships. And so, how does it show up in the minds of our children? Does it show up as favoritism, or does this just show up as, the relationships are kind of fluid and they change. And, sometimes, you're going to be clicking with one kid and other times you might be clicking with another, although there is some stability to favoritism in research. But, it's, if a kid has more shared interests, like if you're really into dance and your kid's really into dance, you're probably going to click more than, if you don't like dance. And you're like, why are you doing that?
Well, we need to wrap up, but I just wanted to say, John, that I'm really glad that you said accept and manage these situations, because a lot of times when people hear the word acceptance, they think, well, I should just let this go, or, not do anything about it. But we're not talking about some sort of passive, resigned acceptance. We're talking about steely-eyed, this is the way things are right now. So, okay, what do I need to do? And managing the situation, coping, dealing with it effectively from that stance of this is the way things are right now, rather than fighting with these things. It shouldn't be this way right now. So thank you for mentioning that.
Well, we probably operate somewhat similarly in our work then, because I have a very similar approach. Yeah.
Yes. Sounds like very much so. So, once again, your book is coming out. It's already up on Amazon. Raising Loving Siblings, How to Stop the Fighting and Help Your Kids Connect.
I'll be getting it. I still have more questions to talk about.
Great. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. It's coming. I think the date it's coming at is December 27th, which is perfect because we've just gone through the holidays and everybody wants to kill each other after it's over. So there you go. Happy reading for January.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
Wonderful. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, you can pre-order it now.
Oh, exciting. Well, thank you. I feel a little bit wiser, a little bit more in my toolbox, and a little less anxious. I love what you said about anxiety. You're absolutely right. It's about being able to cope. I'm feeling that we're capable. And I feel
and
that
you certainly
little bit.
are. The truth of the matter is, and you probably both know this very well, is that the more people think about and worry about these things, the better they are as parents, typically.
Yes.
So the ones who are, don't ask these questions typically are not. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a fine line.
Yes. That's reassuring.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I'm confident you're doing well.
Thank you.
All right.
I'll tell my kids.
So much. Yes. Yeah.
Bring them next time.
Yeah.
We'll do a group session.
Awesome. This is amazing. Thank you so much. Thank
you for having me again. Yeah, enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.